All right, welcome everyone to this panel on the European Universities Initiative. We're going to get started, even if people are starting to progressively come in after the coffee break. I'm really happy to welcome some of my colleagues which are present here. We've been working for 2 years on the initiative, and it's really fantastic to welcome them in Oxford today. So my name is Antonin Charret. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. Nadia Manzoni is a doctoral researcher at the Central European University. Alina Felder sadly could not be with us today, but we will take over some of her sections and still present her really interesting work on the topic. Agata, Lambrechts, the senior researcher at USI and at the Schubert in Switzerland. And finally, Daniela Craciun is an assistant professor at the University of Twente. So our whole panel today is really on the new developments in European higher education, particularly through a specific policy that was launched in 2019, which is the European Universities Initiative. So maybe some of you have never heard of this initiative, so don't worry. We'll start from the basics a little bit so you can follow a little bit what it is. So the initiative was launched initially in 2019 and intended to be the flagship higher education program by the European Commission. It has the objective to strengthen visibility and competitiveness in the European Union, foster European culture, solidarity, and identity, and bring about new forms of interinstitutional cooperation of the entire EU. Now, these European universities are transnational collaborative partnerships throughout the EU, and they have really ambitious objectives, mainly to transform the higher education landscape in the EU, so just that, and to create a higher education dimension of a newly launched European education area. So how does it work? Basically, these universities are partnerships from a minimum of 3 higher education institutions that need to be at a minimum of 3 different EU member states or Erasmus Plus program countries. There's an exception for countries that are currently in negotiation to rejoin Erasmus Plus, like Switzerland, and the Western Balkans. And there's some key criteria for cooperation, such as a joint long-term strategy, creating inter-university campuses transnationally, and really foster this cooperation from different parts of Europe by achieving a form of geographical balance between the north, the south, the east, and the west of the EU. Now, since the start of the initiative in 2019, there have been 5 different funding phases for a total budget of 1.4 billion euros. It may seem like a lot, but when you speak to stakeholders, they say it's peanuts in regards to the ambitious objectives that they have. And it involves 65 alliances that have been selected that gather 570 higher education institutions. It's about 20% of the entire higher education landscapes in the EU and over 50% of the entire student population of the European Union. I'll hand over to my colleague Nadia Manzoni, who will speak a little bit about what are the challenges with European higher education.
So why did we become interested in this topic in the first place, apart from it being quite cool as an object of study? You may or may not know there's been 25 years of collaboration at European level when it comes to higher education, harmonization, and standardization, but always as part of an intergovernmental cooperation process outside of the structures of the European Union. And the European Union itself has had its higher education policies and instruments, obviously funding programs like Erasmus+, but also what is termed open method of coordination, coordination on policy initiatives among the member states, very soft touch, soft law, and very incremental and slow to progress. And it has been a sort of marginal observer to the Bologna process all along. But and it's known that European Union doesn't have strong competences in the area of education, rather supporting competences, which means supporting mobility and transnational and joint programs at European level, but all the while preserving linguistic and cultural diversity of the education systems of the member state. And we've always, it's been recognized that there's some kind of governance puzzle where the EU has really high ambitions for its education systems, and at the same time, really low competences in steering those education systems. And in the general climate of Euroscepticism and sort of move to the right with right-wing nationalism and de-internationalization that we heard about yesterday, we were curious, how was it possible in those political and legal constraints that this initiative, the European Universities Initiative, was made possible, and how significant is its impact on the higher education sector in the EU?
And so to understand how the EU navigates these limited competencies in higher education, as higher education is subsidiary, so it follows nation states, and how does it take these limited competencies and combine it with these great aspirations for what higher education should be. We look at the history of the idea of European universities, but also the histories of policy making in the EU on higher education. And we start from the observation that the idea of the European university is not new. In fact, it was older than the European Union itself. The European community was established in 1957 and then replaced by the European Union in 1993. But already in 1949, we have the College of Europe in Bruges that tried to that was founded to foster the spirit of solidarity and mutual understanding in the European space, especially between Western countries after the Second World War. And then we have like 2 decades of this idea popping up as a solution to various political and economic problems in the European space. But it has been controversial because no nation states wanted to give up competency, and they were fighting about where should these institutions be placed and who is going to fund them and what's the legal authority around them. But in 1972, the European University Institute was founded in Florence as an intergovernmental organization which aimed to be the leading university in social sciences in the EU. And then in 2008, its technological counterpart was set up in Budapest, the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, which tries to create an innovation ecosystem through partnerships so that they are leading technological and innovation developments through the knowledge innovation communities that they create across Europe. Now, in 2017, Europe was already in a decade of polycrisis, sleepwalking its way from one crisis to the next with the danger of never waking up, as the then Commissioner Juncker put it. And ultimately, the refugee crisis was happening, the economic crisis happened, neo-nationalisms or various forms of nationalisms were coming out, and then ultimately Brexit, the first time an EU member state left the Union, and arguably the most prestigious higher education system in the EU left. So the EU was definitely in a crisis as to how to keep the prestige and how to keep the cohesion in the EU. And in 2017, we have President Emmanuel Macron starting his term and kind of wanting France to take a leading position in this and reviving this idea of European universities. And then just 6 months later, we already have, calls for European university coming up and a very fast process of implementing this.
So we're going to rewind a little bit. And as my colleagues just mentioned, the idea of a European university is not new, and education programs in the European Union are not new. However, if we're going to trace back a path towards an education policy field in the European Union, we could argue that the first real date is 2000 with the launch of the Lisbon strategy. You're all aware that in 2000, the EU made big declarations that it wanted to become the most competitive knowledge economy in the world, and that it was going to achieve this. Now, things didn't exactly go as planned, and despite these big effects of announcement, just a few years later, the Lisbon strategy had to be relaunched to give it another momentum. And you're going to see this throughout this timeline. The idea of European education policy by the EU is basically a story of missed opportunities despite some successes, and it's quite a laborious road to 2017 where we're really going to start speaking about the European Universities Initiative. So the relaunch of the Lisbon strategy, though interestingly, was accompanied by a modernization agenda for universities. The first time there was really a strategy specifically geared for universities, and universities had this role of embodying employment and skills in the European Union. But much like the launch of the Lisbon strategy, the modernization agenda also had to be relaunched just a few years later. So we have the modernization agenda 2.0, which tried to give, again, another momentum for the EU. But something changed in between. You can see before 2006, despite the fact that there's EU programs, you all know of Erasmus, for example, all of the education funding from the EU is completely fragmented. You have a bunch of different actions, no central governance or whatnot. In 2007, after the launch of the modernization agenda for universities, you have the lifelong learning program, which is launched, which has since become Erasmus+, which is a single funding mechanism, which gives the EU the possibility to have action in education policy. And you can see throughout this timeline that not only is it creating this program, but for each funding phase of the EU, the budget almost continuously doubles. So you have an even more financial power from the EU to intervene in education policy, which gives it even more strength. At the same time, the EU starts using really coordination methods in order to bring all stakeholders around the table to develop its programs and to develop its policies. And that's what it did for the renewed agenda. Modernization agenda wasn't completely working, so I thought, let's bring together member states, stakeholders throughout the entire EU to reflect on the challenges and what needs to be done in regards to higher education policy. So with the renewed agenda, there's a very long 2-year consultation phase in order to develop this. And this is where we're going to lead in the policies that we're interested in today, the European Universities Initiative and the European Education Area, which are the development of these continued increase in funding and the development of this coordination method in order to gain this competence. And from 2017, what we argue is that it's a pivotal moment in European education policymaking with a real change that occurs. We're going to do a zoom in regards to understand really what's happening in that year. But since then, there's been a real ambition which has been transmitted in regards to what is named a European strategy for universities, which was actually the continuation of the modernization and renewed agenda. In fact, originally it was called the transformation agenda, which really signaled a will to transform the European higher education landscape, and more recently has led to the Union of Skills just last month, which we'll go into a bit more detail. So we consider that in 2017, you have really 6 months that shook European higher education policy. And what's surprising is not necessarily the success of the initiative, but the speed and the scale at which it really took its face. So in May 2017, you have the renewed agenda that's published. As I mentioned, the renewed agenda is the result of a really long, fastidious coordination process where all the stakeholders were consulted. Everybody had the possibility to give its opinion, and the EU took this into action in order to develop this renewed agenda. However, when it was published, stakeholders I interviewed mentioned it wasn't sexy enough. It didn't really meet the ambition, and it didn't meet exactly all the promises that it had. So just a few months later, the EU drops the renewed agenda as such, not the content of it, but the name of it, and actually develops something new. Something new is happening in September, and Daniela mentioned this. You have Macron, President Macron, who does a speech on European universities, but let's not give Macron too much credit, because it's not really his idea. Macron is speaking about the development of the European Union and how France needs to play a big role in this, and he is speaking to his European partners, but he's also speaking to the French higher education sector. In fact, the idea comes from a note circulated by the French Conference of Rectors during the presidential campaign that was giving some suggestions of where the future of higher education could go and how a European dimension of higher education could benefit the French higher education system. So Macron is speaking to them. At the same time, there's a change of leadership at the European Commission with a new head of units of the higher education unit in the Commission, which is very ambitious and really wants to leave her mark on a new initiative. And despite not discarding completely the conclusions of the renewed agenda, she thinks we need to develop ambitious and marketable initiatives as well. And there's a third factor that intervenes. The Commission is aware that a month later, there's going to be a meeting of all heads of states in Gothenburg, which is going to discuss the promotion and renegotiation of the social pillar, the pillar of social rights in the European Union. And they discover that education and training has put as #1 on the agenda by member states. So they see this as an opportunity. So after Macron's speech, the Commission in just 3 weeks puts together a communication and develops this idea of European universities and European education, and the European education area, because it knows it's going to be able to present it to member states, potentially for them to approve it immediately. Usually in European education policymaking, it's higher education and research ministers that get together, discuss things, and potentially agree on things. Here, the idea is to bypass the ministries and get the approval from the heads of states directly, which is exactly what happened. They present the idea in November, and by December, there's a council conclusion where all the heads of states have agreed for the development of European universities and a European education area. However, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the idea of European higher education policy is a lot an idea of missed opportunities. It's not the first time that there's ambitious ideas that are put forward by member states or by the Commission. And what makes it that instead of promoting an ambitious idea, this one didn't actually fall down the drain almost as quickly as it appeared? Well, we identified 8 different factors which have made it a successful development, or at least can justify its rapid upscaling here. First, there's crises. Daniela mentioned it really well. Brexit played a really big role in the development of the initiative. And in fact, when they presented the European Education Area and the European Universities Initiative, the idea is to strengthen European identity. They consider that there's a need to fight the emergence of right-wing populisms through education. So that played a really big role in the development. Then the upscaling of the initiative was also marked very much by COVID, which actually played in the favor of the initiative. Now you may think it's all about transnational collaboration and mobility. How did it help? Well, COVID gave the opportunity for the alliances to justify digital mobility as a true form of mobility that can actually be recognized by member states. It wasn't the case in most member state laws that this existed as a form of mobility. And this gave the possibility for alliances to actually develop these hybrid formats, which really gave them the possibility to create these inter-university campuses and whatnot. So COVID played very much in the favor and gave a justification for the necessity for European universities. And finally, there's the Russian invasion of Ukraine as well, which really mobilized the higher education sector in the EU and was put forward as a very important aspect for a need of creating these European universities. I've mentioned it a little bit when we looked a little bit at what was happening precisely in 2017. There was an institutional and policy window that emerged with the Gothenburg sentence, with Macron's election, and with a change of head of unit. All these happened simultaneously, and all the different stakeholders who were involved took the advantage of this and took the opportunity to upscale an initiative very quickly and get it approved as quickly as possible for it to be developed. So everyone involved took the opportunity and pushed it forward. Then there's the idea of nested policy ideas. I've mentioned you the European Universities Initiative and a European Education Area being created. Both initiatives were launched simultaneously, but they're not in parallel. They feed into each other. The European Universities Initiative is meant to be a flagship initiative in order to achieve a European education area, which means all of its developments affect the European education area, but similarly, all the developments in regards to the European education area have had a positive impact in regards to the EUI. They feed into each other, and there's a real co-development of the development. There's an experience in policy coordination, which has been immense. We saw it, and we joked about it a little bit when we saw the development of the European education policy field. It was laborious. It didn't always work, and the EU had to try different things in order to mobilize stakeholders and get them around the table to see what worked and how to negotiate. After 15 years of this laborious idea, it actually managed to develop a good system involving all the stakeholders to what it calls co-create an initiative. And you may consider it didn't really co-create an initiative, it still promotes its own agenda, which may be true, but what it was successful in doing is giving all stakeholders, member states or whatnot, the feeling that they were involved. And that was a key idea in regards for member states to actually approve the initiative and push it forward. So that was a real success for the Commission. Then there's the joint use of governance mechanisms. We mentioned at the beginning, the EU has limited competence in education. However, it does have a few weapons at its disposal in order to push education policy forward. Policy coordination, we mentioned it. We saw it with the increase of the Erasmus Plus budget as well. It has a financial tool in order to target universities directly and promote the initiative. And finally, it also had the possibility to promote the adoption of non-binding legal acts. While they're non-binding, they still have a huge power in agenda setting and getting member states to approve some policy directions. These were all used in education policy throughout the 2000s. It's the first time that they're used, the three at the same time, for the initiative to meet the ambitions that are put forward. There was cooperation in the EU between the higher education sector beforehand. However, the EU developed a program in order to disrupt this landscape of collaboration through competition to reconfigure this cooperation and promote its own policy agenda as well, making it even more influential as well. So what we've been seeing really, it's very common usually in the literature to speak about European higher education policy to be a tug of war between member states and EU institutions, always fighting for a bit more influence, with the member states not wanting to give the European Union institutions more power and the EU always acting for more. And this tug of war is what brings education policy forward. What we've seen with the development of the initiative is something that looks much more like a three-legged race, with both all the entities, the stakeholders, the member states, and EU institutions joined together, going in a similar direction, which justifies the speed and the rapid upscaling of the initiative.
So given this history of the idea that the SO is not new, and given this history of EU policy making in higher education, we asked ourselves, is the European Universities Initiative an old idea with new clothes, or is it a new idea with old clothes? What is happening here? And we recognize here the importance of ideas in policy change as a vehicle, also for EU policy making in this sector where it is under the subsidiarity principle. We see that ideas can shape interests in institutions, values, and through basically perceptions and beliefs about how the EU higher education should look like. The idea, as we saw, was not new, but what is new is that it doesn't resemble previous iterations, which were based on one institution. Now we have these networks of institutions at a very big scale, as we can see in this map, how many institutions participate in the initiative in each country. It's a different scale in terms of policy ambitions, and it's a different scale in terms of stakeholder engagement, this co-creation that Antonin was mentioning. At the policy level, we also see that the EU is walking this fine balance between presenting policies as new, innovative, re-emerging, modernizing, transforming, so that they can get excitement from stakeholders, but also as old, so as not to overstep their competence and get the member states really freaked out about what's going on. Are we losing competency in higher education? So we are asking ourselves, is this initiative leading to continuity in what we see in the higher education landscape, or to discontinuity? And to answer this question, we put together a volume looking at continuities, changes, and challenges for the European higher education landscape, as it comes now to the 5 years of this initiative taking place. It's going to be published by Springer next year in the Higher Education Dynamics series. And the overarching question of the book is the European Universities Initiative revolutionizing European higher education, delivering on these, extensive promises that Antonin also mentioned, or is it merely just another policy experiment in this line of policy experiments that we have seen? Is it more of the same? And we want to critically examine this emergent collaboration landscape that we see at the European level and its implications for the future of European higher education area. And to this end, we selected around 30 chapters dealing with these 3 themes of the book. We have around 70 authors looking into this idea of continuities and discontinuities, combining both researchers and practitioners, because this is a constantly changing area, but also bringing together different disciplines from political science, European higher education studies, STI, public policy, etc., and also looking at various scale. Where are continuities and discontinuities happening at institutional, national, or European level? So we ask in the book, where does the EUI continue existing paths of cooperation? Where does it diverge from them, and how? How do alliances navigate the challenges of cooperation in this long history that we saw? And how can it be supported to achieve the long-term objectives? What are the potential future directions that we see emerging for the higher education landscape? And in the next section, we will show you a glimpse into what we found at various levels.
Thank you. Yeah. We will present the 3 areas. First, I'll speak about the geography of the initiative, and then Daniela will talk about the impact on national policy making, the national funding of this initiative, and then Nadia will talk about the impact on the EU level policies and EU higher education governance. So starting with the geography of the initiative, it has grown from the initial goal of 20 alliances that were called for in the Macron's speech, to now 65 alliances with almost 600 higher education institutions. Antonin mentioned 570. Those are the ones that receive funding from the EU, but actually a number of British institutions and Swiss institutions also participate as full members in the initiative. In the UK, they self-fund their participation. In Switzerland, the Swiss government is currently funding it, but with their reassociation and the EU funding as we go on. We can say that the initiative is now entering a maturing phase following an intensive experimentation phase of the pilot calls. We have 2 pilot calls and then longer term funding, three rounds of those. And the current discussions are about the future of the initiative. how should it be funded and how is it going to develop? Should we extend it further? Should we reduce the number? And those questions relate to perhaps most often discussed question concerning the initiative, at least in research, but also by other stakeholders. And that is the question of the relative importance of inclusivity, and cohesion, which are the underlying principles of the European Union on one hand, and the excellence of the initiative, which is supposed to deliver on these huge ambitions of supporting the digital and transitions, contributing to the competitiveness of the higher education institutions, but also wider to the competitiveness of the European Union. So this aspiration to balance this maybe paradoxical goals of excellence and inclusivity would require a move away from the past trends, which in Europe see the concentration of funding, in particular for research, in certain regions of Europe, so the so-called EU 15, so the old members of the European Union, and also in a relatively small number of very prestigious, very large institutions. So to be able to answer this question, is there a balance? Are we seeing the balance? We looked at mostly quantitative data, comparing the institutions that participate in the initiative, so almost 600, with the wider higher education landscape. So we used the micro data, so statistical data at individual institutional level from the European Higher Education Sector Observatory. So about 600 participating institutions as part of around 3,000 of the institutions that are covered by the data set. We also looked at the status. So we operationalized it by the position in the academic ranking of world universities. So we compared the institutions that participate versus those who don't. And we looked at the individual composition of the alliances, who works with whom. We also computed the correlation between the number of participations for different countries and the system size, so how many students do they have. And we looked at the relationship with geographical patterns and status. And finally, we created an analyzed data set of previous joint participations in pre-existing organizational networks or partnerships to find out if they knew each other before they started to work together. For the findings, we find that the institutions that participate in the initiative are predominantly large, or very large, in terms of academic personnel and in terms of students. So we have very many participants with more than 10,000 students, very many institutions with more than 25,000 students, which contributes to this 50% coverage of the student body in Europe. These are predominantly PhD awarding institutions, which means they could be referred as traditional universities. They generalist or comprehensive. There is a slight STEM orientation when compared to all institutions in Europe. But most of the participating institutions are not specialized. So there are not that many arts schools, business schools, universities of applied sciences. The participating institutions have a strong research orientation. So they have more PhD students and they have a higher publication intensity than the average institution in Europe. And they have a lower education intensity. So they may have a lot of students, but they have a lower ratio of students to staff. And finally, they have a strong international profile, and that's both in terms of Erasmus exchanges and the share of foreign degree students. We've been following the developments over time with these different calls, and it has been changing somewhat. So we find that with these latest enlargements in 2023 and 2024 in particular, there is an increasing number of small and medium-sized institutions taking part. although the proportion of the University of Applied Sciences, the more specialized institution, has actually decreased. So more of the new institutions that are joining are also universities. But they are less STEM-oriented than old members and slightly less research-oriented, so lower number of PhD students, lower publishing rates. And they're less international, in particular in relation to the shares of foreign students for the degree level. So they still higher than average in terms of Erasmus incoming students, but they may be newer to the internationalization processes. And then finally, they have fewer prior cooperation links than the initial, the old alliance. Then if we look at the status, again, it has been changing. So the old members, the initial members of the alliances were occupying the highest status rank. So they were the highest ranked institutions. You can see, this is for the whole data set, so this is for the whole 65 alliances. You can see that 80% of the European higher education institutions, which are in the top 100 institutions in the world, participate in the initiative. The other 20% are probably the British institutions that are not able to get funding. So that might be part of the explanation why we don't have 100% participation. But with each enlargement of the initiative, there was a higher and higher number of institutions with lower status. So the lower ranked or unranked institutions taking part. We could argue that's because the pool of the highest ranked institution has dried up. The new alliances have to incorporate those unranked institutions. But even with this enlargement, we don't see a lot of mixing of the highest status institutions collaborating with the lowest or the unranked institutions, which are majority of the higher education institutions in Europe. And then finally, if we look at the geographical spread, you can see that 40% of the participating institutions come from the large European countries, Germany, Spain, France, and Italy. But it's not surprising because they have very large number of institutions and a lot of students. The only outlier is the UK, huge system size, but as mentioned, they don't get funding. So there are only 10 institutions that are classed as full members, not of the project, but of the alliances. But otherwise, the correlation is very high. It has marginally decreased with the recent enlargements, which indicates that there is more participation from institutions from the countries with smaller system size. In summary, we can say that the picture is mixed. It hasn't completely eradicated this replication of vertical stratification and regional inequalities that we observed in the early iterations of the initiative, but it is moving towards more inclusivity. It's partially because of how the criteria have not really changed, but has been pushed with each enlargement from the European Commission to include different types of institutions, and especially those from the newer EU member states. So there are more less intensive in terms of research institutions. There are not more types maybe, but more geographical representation, which is showing that the EU is still working on this balancing act between excellence and inclusion. And these discussions are still going now on whether we should extend, we should have new alliances, or whether new members should join the existing alliances. So it remains to be seen if the balance will tip towards even more inclusion in the future.
So what do we see in terms of continuity and discontinuity at the national level, and in terms of the collaboration landscape that is emerging in Europe? in a systematic literature review that we did of the challenges that European universities are facing, we found three main areas of challenges in terms of governance, funding, and policy. When it comes to governance, these alliances have complex institutional or complex governance structures in line with their long-term ambitions, but not in line with their project-based funding that is just 3 years. And they have diverse institutional leadership structures with diverse cycle lengths, which requires renewed buy-in from the leadership, because as you will see, they have to put quite a lot of own co-funding and in-kind funding to make this project work. The current funding model is unsustainable for alliances. There is definitely need for additional co-funding, either from the institutional or national level, to support the development and implementation of the strategies and of the partnerships that alliances are making. But they get different levels of funding support from their ministries, as you will see. At the policy level, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future developments of the initiative, which also comes from existing legal and regulatory barriers. So despite having Bologna for 25 years and trying to synchronize and cooperate, we still see a lot of actual barriers in practice, coming from incompatibilities in external quality assurance, but also limited acceptance of degrees, structured asymmetric ECTS implementation, limited mutual automatic recognition of degrees. All the things we thought we solved, they are still there, as alliances show. And finally, there is this tension of how can we maintain linguistic diversity and multilingualism in our higher education systems, while at the same time, ensuring an efficient collaboration, especially in the context of very limited resources that these alliances work with. And in terms of funding, funding can come from 3 different levels: from the European level, the institutional level, and the national level. At the European level, this can be targeted funding, as we saw from the Erasmus Plus project, but also dedicated horizon funding for innovating the infrastructure of research, because obviously the other institutions are not very happy to have targeted horizon funding just for alliances. From the institutional level, there's a minimum of 20% co-funding that each alliance has to bring in line with their application. And there's also non-targeted competitive goals from the national and European level that they are pulling in to cover the cost. But still, anecdotal evidence or what we hear is that the European institutional funding only cover about 40% of the activities that alliances can do. So where is the other money coming from? And in many cases, the national and system level has stepped up to provide some additional funding for this initiative. And we, with my colleague Alina, we looked at comparing what are different member states in the EU doing in terms of co-funding the initiative, and how has this pattern of co-funding changed over time. What we find is that there are like 4 funding models for the initiative. There's either states that provide no support to the initiative, but these are very few. And then there are the ones that provide direct support for targeted funding, mainly subsidies, like, for example, covering the co-funding institutions have to bring. They are the ones that offer indirect support through, for example, for performance-based funding agreements or performance-based formula that reward institutions for pursuing internationalization, and then this money can be used for alliances. And then there's those countries that combine direct and indirect support. These funding models we find come with different levels of financial support for alliances, different stability over time and what institution can count on, and different embeddedness in the funding system, which means there's a lot of institutions that don't know if they can count on this at the next funding round. And it leads to different contributions to institutions within, even in the same alliance or even in the same higher education system. The national funding of alliances shows the commitment of nation states to the initiative on the one hand, but on the other hand, we all know that the public funding for higher education institutions is decreasing for various reasons, either shifting priorities due to investment in defense because of the geopolitical situation, or the election of far right-wing governments who see universities as the enemy and are not very willing to increase funding or even keep it at the same level for institutions. So this is a really huge problem for institutions in these alliances. However, another way they can be supported is through removing barriers to cooperation at the national levels. So for example, by alleviating legal issues around pooling resources, whether it's human resources, technological resources, or financial resources, better aligning administrative structures, for example, quality assurance or procedures in quality assurance, and actually implementing the Bologna process instruments we already have since a long time. And the research coming from the European Commission this year shows that, in fact, many member states have removed or are planning to remove barriers to higher education cooperation, and especially as it comes to joint transnational activities, especially in harmonizing admission and enrollment criteria for lifelong learning, more lax regulations where it comes to language of instruction or online learning for joint degrees, a broader definition, as we mentioned, for what mobility means, not just physical mobility but hybrid and virtual mobility, and developing micro-credentials, or actually implementing joint degrees in particular systems, because even if this was agreed intergovernmentally in the Bologna process in 2015, countries have not allowed universities to pursue joint degrees. And in Romania, for example, alliances and the Quality Assurance Agency lobbied the government to change the higher education law and were successful. And Nadia will talk about what's happening at the EU level.
Okay, so aside from triggering domestic policy change, funding changes, we can also say with quite a lot of confidence that something has changed also in the way the EU does policy in higher education as a result of European University Alliances being there. And what we mean more specifically, I think there are elements of both changes to policies, changes to the process, and changes to the actors in this arena of policymaking at European level. The policies that we have listed here and that we mentioned before, they were enabled by the fact that European University Alliances have an invested interest in there being quality assurance of joint programs at European level, in there being a strategy that defines their future goals, in there being reward for academics and practitioners in universities who deal with transnational collaboration, which takes time and effort. And they also have an interest in potential European degree. Currently, it's being discussed as a label with the potential to move to a degree, which means that would enable the joint programs that alliances offer jointly to have one qualification or to be labeled as European at the end, and students to have an additional added value on the labor market. Also, some of the alliances are calling for a European statute, which is just a legal entity that represents all the universities together that would allow them to do joint purchasing, joint recruitment, and so on. And the alliances are also very much interested in the merger of policies for research, for science, and for higher education. And we have chapters in the book that look at the policies across research and higher education, and they find an integration of those policies, at least nominally, in these policy documents over time since alliances have arrived. When it comes to the processes, the European Commission has sort of teamed up with the alliances and alliance representation in what they call a co-creation process, and that has enabled all these changes to take place. So there's a kind of a renewed relationship that is directly sort of from the Commission to the universities, and the member states sort of come a bit later. And our colleague Alina, who's not here today, but she talks about projectification because alliances are ultimately just projects from the perspective of the European Union, but yet the beneficiaries of these projects come together with the Commission in this policymaking process, and they influence the policymaking process as it suits them in order for them to meet those project objectives. We also have new actors that are emerging. The alliances themselves could be called a new political actor in this sphere. They now have an alliance of alliances for EU for All, which is a gigantic community of practice based in Brussels and with lots of subgroups that will try to have joint statements on particular policy issues and influence the policymaking process, both at the European level, but also at national level. And the students who represent student interest in the alliances, they also have their own European level association now that is meeting and trying to influence policy. So I think arguably there's quite a lot happening that is new at European level. But what we don't know is if that really constitutes European integration, or or not. This, I think, depends on your definition of European integration and your view of the Europeanization. And I think you could claim with quite a lot of certainty that there's a sort of ideational conversion about the role of universities in Europe. That's there, that this initiative has spread effectively and diffused these ideas. There's definitely new institutions and new European level coordination. But the domestic effect, is it just targeting European university alliances, or is it also going to spread to the rest of the sector? I think the jury is still out on this. But there is a lively research community that is researching this question and many other questions when it comes to alliances. And we are part of that community, and we meet regularly online and exchange and make research projects, try to publish, and a bit of shameless self-promotion. In June, we're organizing a research and practice symposium, not just for scientists, but also for practitioners from within alliances who are interested in researching the processes that are seen happening. And we had great success with the call for abstracts, and it's going to be a 2-day packed program. We also did a little literature review of everything that's been published so far on alliances in order to get a better sense of all these different lenses that people are applying to this initiative, because you could really take so many angles to this, as you've seen in today's presentation. And from the 36 peer-reviewed publications, which since I think a few days ago has turned into 46, because there's been a new edited volume published. You have a reference here if you want to look it up. Not ours yet, another one. We see that these are predominantly qualitative studies, and a lot of them focus on a single case study, many of them on European level, fewer on a sort of comparison between alliances that would try and figure out what works, what doesn't, and fewer also on comparison of universities within alliances. So these are a bit the areas that we need to still be strengthened in research. And the different researchers take very different views of this initiative. So there's the policy view using public policy theories to explain how it all came about and how the policy is developing. There's also a lot of research on how alliances have formed, how they found their partners, how does that change the institutional landscape in Europe. There's interesting studies on using European integration theories to explain the process of this sort of convergence. And a lot, or the majority, takes a sort of organizational studies approach to look at what happens to the universities within the alliances as a result of them being members of the institution. A very interesting one, which I'm surprised to find so many articles on, is basically viewing this as a vehicle to further innovation or a pedagogical innovation in higher education. So there's a lot of interest in how, for instance, alliances have contributed to innovation in teaching and learning, digitalization, digital campuses, sustainable development goals in teaching, micro-credentials, and so on, multilingualism. So it's an interesting thing to look at. If we would take 3 sort of takeaway lessons from this, from the research community we are part of, we would say that in order to sort of safeguard the positive effects of this initiative, and in order to sort of engage in its or make it sustainable, we would need a lot more impact assessment studies on what is actually happening in these alliances and in its universities using quantitative methods and semi-experimental design and so on. There would need to be a lot more engagement. I mean, a lot of these articles are written by practitioners, and they have a sort of narrow view of it's very wealthy and very rich, but there would need to be a lot more engagement with sort of classical theories to see how do the alliances shed a new light on some classic theories. And finally, and this is maybe unusual, but we see that this is such a field that where the scholars have to talk to practitioners, because otherwise there's a disconnect. And so we will continue to work on offering a space and a platform for these two groups to meet. And our book also has the big challenge of having a big theoretical, sort of conceptual part and a practitioner-led part. And we're going to try to bridge those two worlds.
So we'll just end on the future directions of the European Universities Initiative, particularly with some announcements that have been made over the last 6 months. So last summer, there was 2 reports that were ordered by the European Union institutions by former Italian PMs, Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta, to discuss the future of the common market in the European Union and competitiveness in the European Union. I won't speak about the Draghi report that does mention education in universities, but more what Enrico Letta says. And his main proposal, and this is the first chapter of his report, is to create a fifth dimension to the European single market. Now, as you know, the single market is currently articulated around four aspects of free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. What Letta suggested is to add knowledge as a fifth freedom for the single market. Now, this has gathered quite a lot of attention and a lot of noise, and if this was something that was embraced by member states and put forward, it could even potentially mean an evolution in the competence of EU institutions in the field of education. But that's still very much to be determined. And finally, last month, the EU published its new big education strategy called the Union of Skills. As you know, there's just been a new European Commission that has been in place since last December. And what's interesting with this strategy is that it builds on what the European Universities Initiative has done. And while we don't necessarily discuss always the successes of the alliances or whatnot, what we can see is that the European Commission has been successful. One big thing is that it's put the European Universities Initiative for a time on everybody's lips. EU institutions, obviously, but also member states who don't necessarily need to be talking about alliances all the time or even recognize them as legitimate actors. And they have. Even next month, there's a meeting of all alliances organized by the Polish presidency of the European Council. This has been done by Spain and by France precedently as well, really recognizing them as such. And the EU is probably going to try to capitalize on what has been achieved in regards to the development of the initiative in other educational domains. It wants to implement a vocational education and training strategy exactly mirrored on the work that was done for the European Strategy for Universities in 2022. It promotes the idea of creating secondary school alliances, which would be built on the model of the European University Alliance. There's obviously the continued rollout of the EUI. We discussed that there's still a lot of question marks in regards to what that would mean. Enlargement, excellent inclusion, or whatnot. Nadia also mentioned the development of the European degree. It's still very high on the agenda, although there's a lot of questions about what it would mean. And there's the idea of creating a European vocational education and training certificate or diploma. So these are big announcements. It's very hard to see if these were things which are going to pull through. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the idea of education policy in the EU is a lot of missed opportunities, despite a lot of successes. But what we do know is we have a better idea of what are the conditions that were necessary for the rapid upscaling of the European Universities Initiative. And you could imagine that similar aspects could need to be deployed for the development of these new directions. It's unknown if it'll always take place. It will be sufficient or if they're necessary, but in any case, it has set forward all these different directions. So we'll have to continue examining, and we will stop it here and take your questions. Thank you. Could you please introduce yourself? And
thank you for the presentation. My name is Eduardo. I work for the British Council. Just an observation and then a question. The observation is about the map where you locate where the alliances are based. I think what would be really interesting is to see the proportion of how many of the eligible universities are in an alliance, because I saw it was skewed towards obviously the big countries. And I wonder how that would look like, you know, the color-coded map of proportion. So that's an observation. Sorry. The question is, and sorry, this is a bit out of the presentation itself. It has to do with the European education area as a framework under which the alliances are supposed to flourish, and the European higher education area. Because obviously, I work for a British institution, and we are in the European higher education area as a country. I don't think that we can be as embedded in the European education area. Do you see how do you see these two, playing out together? Is there any tension that you see? Is that I've heard in some places that the European Commission wanted to move faster because the CGHE goes a bit. I mean, it's 49 countries at the end of the day, so it takes a long time to coordinate that. What's your opinion?
In terms of the first comment on proportion, we actually calculated that, and I agree. I think a map, a heat map of how it would look like would be very interesting. What we find is actually that there is quite a proportional participation, actually favoring smaller states rather than bigger states. So they have more universities represented because their system is smaller, and as the initiative expanded, they slowly became more representative, even the big states. And in terms of the EHEA going very slowly, I think, yes, we agree that that is happening. We saw that the Bologna instruments that were agreed upon at national level were not fully implemented. And the Commission is trying this European education area where we would have a faster development because it has this competency over collaboration, over transnational and international collaboration between universities. I have not personally seen any tension between the European education area and the European universities initiative. I don't know if we agree on this, but yeah, I think it's more a vehicle for promoting the European education area rather than, yeah, they are not at the same level in a sense.
Maybe to build on what Daniela is saying, I think when you look at the literature, like most of it speaks that there was already a two-tier space within the European higher education area. And this is before even the launch of the European education area, whatnot. So in a way, you could consider that the EEA is just acknowledging a reality that already existed, that there is, not you're creating a second space, is that there's already a two-tier space and you're just acknowledging and creating a reality for actually moving quicker and faster, which was a demand of the institutions itself. So I think they continue existing in complementarity. And while I haven't heard any tensions, you do hear of some member states and some institutions that say that it would be great to be able to continue including as much as possible the 49 countries, just because you want to continue cooperating with partners that you already have. But I don't think the European education area will necessarily mean that that's over for cooperation. I think it's more.
Would you like to make it louder?
It's over. Okay. Yeah.
You can also come closer.
Shona, yeah.
Hi everyone, Daniela from Oxford. My question is kind of like on the previous question, and because it's very informative, and I'm also wondering because you have mentioned the tension between EU's policy and also UI's. I'm wondering, and also disrupting collaboration through competition. So I'm wondering when the tensions happens between the EU and the EUI. What's your responsibility as you are researching the UI? What do you think the UI's responsibility in kind of promoting a collaboration, or is just following the EU's kind of strategy, like kind of because you are seeing the tensions between the followers or the leaders, and so I'm wondering, also you mentioned about the future. What do you think the connections between the European as a region to the outside world, like in other areas? Yeah.
Maybe start from the last question, because I remember that. So the European Universities Initiative is actually starting to include some other members. So a lot of the alliances have said that we cannot be separate from the world. So some of the alliances now include as full members. They don't get the funding, but they include full members institutions in Africa, in Morocco, but also in the southern part of Africa. So there is a bit of spreading. But this is a difficult moment because from our conversations with the member institutions, they obviously have long-standing collaborations also with institutions from across the world. But the world is changing. So they don't know how those collaborations will or will not continue in future. The collaborations with the United States based universities, for example, the issues of funding over there. European institutions don't know if they will be able to continue the same level of organizational cooperation with those. So the European space becomes arguably more important for now as they navigate the changing context.
But I think it's a good critique of like, is the EU just looking in now and focusing on intra-EU cooperation while ignoring other partners and actually replicating at the EU level what is happening at the national level of like closing borders and fortress Europe. And I think based on this critique, this kind of expansion of cooperation patterns has happened. I don't see either like a tension between third or first question between the European Union and the European University Alliances yet, also because it was the pilot phase, the European Union was kind of setting the direction. But I think with this new community of practice, where it's not just the community of practice, but the EU is actually funding its own lobby group and lobby group at the national level, I think in the future we might see tensions between where alliances want to go and where the Commission wants to go with this. So
Just on that, I find it interesting to think about what you said. I mean, do alliances have agency here? Because when we talk about projectification, it may appear like we're just talking about project beneficiaries who then are sort of bound to sort of contribute to the funder. But I don't think that is increasingly less and less the case. I think they're gaining agency. They also have now structures that allow them to do that. But also in between them, they don't have a uniform opinion about things. And this is such a healthy debate. And it's so wonderful to see all these universities meeting and having to discuss European level issues, not just national level issues or regional that affect them. And it's created a great space for agency for universities.
If I can just add to that, we're also doing a little study on the participation of the Swiss and British universities in this initiative, so they don't get funding. So why are they participating? And what we're finding is that they very much want to have the seat at the table. That they see the alliances as drivers of the future of what higher education in Europe will look like. And they don't want to be then following what's been agreed on by others. They want the seat at the table, funding themselves often because it's kind of a direct line from universities to the European Commission, to the European.
Yes, hi, I'm Vasiliki Papatsiba from Cardiff University. So I did study Erasmus Mundus, Bologna, and more recently Brexit. So I'd like to thank you for bringing a topic that we do not hear very frequently about in the UK anymore. So there isn't a lot of audience, I think, so I really enjoyed it. I have a question that is slightly specific, and that comes this why I mentioned what I did before. You covered a large period of time, so I'm conscious that not everything can be included, but I studied Erasmus Mundus, and there was that model of interinstitutional collaboration that emerged with Erasmus Mundus, that the scholarships were offered to students from outside the union. So there were the problems that we saw there around the complexity of governance, the difficulty of aligning different sort of institutional processes. There was also that regret that they were thinking, well, that model is just for attracting students from the outside. What happens? Where do you see that Erasmus Mundus fitting in that history now with those? To me, it sounded as if it was a step towards partnership, but I don't know if you would agree with that.
actually we recently, as part of the study that made an evaluation of the Erasmus Mundus project, because it's been 20 years last year since Erasmus Mundus started. So what is the impact of this program? And definitely there are so many parallels between the European University Initiative and Erasmus Mundus. But while Erasmus Mundus has been struggling to kind of, so it's a grassroots initiative in a sense, departments decide who to cooperate with, make these joint programs, and they have been finding it hard to scale upwards the innovations in teaching and learning and to, spread it through their institutions, because there has been no leadership interest. Many times they saw it as like these little things we're involved in. Whereas with the European Universities Initiative, it's completely the other way around. The leadership is at the table, but somehow the innovations don't necessarily reach the students and the faculty. So there's like kind of a hollow, I don't know what's happening in the middle. I think that would be a really interesting study to carry out. Why don't they scale up and why don't they trickle down this, who is missing from this picture? But definitely.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, just I think the Erasmus Mundus will become relevant again with the European degree discussion if the European degree does survive the political negotiations at the moment, because I think European degree will be a way to bring the grassroots and top down together. So it'll be it won't be exclusive to alliances, open to other partnerships, but alliances are very well placed to roll them out very quickly. So there will continue to be a leadership buy-in, but at the same time, all the previous Erasmus Mundus programs will be probably the first ones, so the existing ones, the first ones to go for a European degree label. So we will see with the European degree implementation if those two levels will come together. Yeah.
And there's also something interesting, which is if you look at the Erasmus Plus midterm evaluation report from 2016, so right before the launch of the initiative, it points to some issues with cooperation actions like Erasmus Mundus. And you see those issues being framed in the call for the first call for the European Universities Initiative. There's this idea that you have too much fragmented funding for a bunch of different projects, and to have actually bigger projects which are more funded, which comes with the alliances as well. So that comparison between the reports and the first call is quite interesting to see how it emerges. And also from some stakeholders I interviewed, there was some skepticism from the new head of unit of the Commission about the success of cooperation actions like Erasmus Mundus, and a real desire to move beyond this as well.
Thank you for the informative presentation. I'm Lin Chang from Tsinghua University. So I have two specific questions. One is, as you introduced that currently there are 65 alliances in the initiative. So I'm just wondering what's the logics or the mechanism support these alliances come together as a alliance. I think that this question directly refers to how we keep this alliances as a categorization rather than a stratification. So how's this mechanism behind these 265 alliances? That's the first question. And the second question is partially, I think, built on Xiaona's questions. I think these European university initiatives or alliances is a very important step of the integration of the European universities. And I think I'm just wondering if this is a kind of trend of a new trend of European internationalization. Does this reflect a trend that the internationalization of Europe is turning to an inward perspective rather than an outward? And does this mean that the internationalization more means a regionalization within the Europe at this time amid a geopolitical tension, especially considering the divergence opinions of the Europe and these relations with US and China and other parts of the world? Thank you.
Can I start on the mechanism? So we did study that as well, several studies in different ways. And we find that there are different mechanisms operating. So some alliances are built around similarities. So they high status, large research intensive institutions. They describe themselves as such. That's what brings us together. We don't maybe say high status, but they say we are the leading research institutions. Others are brought together by instead of similarities, the complementarities. So they see what they're missing beyond the biggest, most well-funded institutions. We don't have competencies in every area. So we join with others so that we can offer best education to our students. They can learn from work experts who are based in the other European countries. We can all of it. So there are similarities, there are complementarities. They some of the initiatives of the alliance, when they apply, they have to kind of show how are they different from others. So they usually choose something that they say brings together. So we are the universities of capital cities, or we are the rural universities, or we are the universities that focus on space studies, even though they are not the whole universities focus on space, but they're saying this is what brings us together. We will focus on collaboration. And we have found for the older, and there were several studies for the initial alliances, the previous networks played a big part. That's not surprising. The call was very quick. Writing of this of these proposals, it's a big task. So it was perhaps easier to do it with trustworthy partners, people who you. There's a bit less of this now, also because the European Union actually facilitates. You can look for potential partners online. There are lots of consultancies that now help the new alliances to be built. So these new alliances are often bringing together institutions that really didn't cooperate in any way with each other before. So the different mechanisms at play maybe are changing the role over time.
Yeah, and I think also to that there's also an institutionalization of this cooperation over time. So we see many of these alliances actually applying for a national or European legal status so that they can pool resources and academic resources, financial resources, human resources together and have the alliance be, an actor in itself, separate in a sense from the institution or from this more loose cooperation that we have seen over time. And I think this is also the big change in terms of how internationalization and how cooperation happens in Europe. Now it's a more whole institutional approach. But yes, indeed, focusing inwards rather than past policies like Erasmus Mundus, which was trying to project power of Europe outwards. I think due to the crisis we had seen for so many years that we're looking like we're going to disintegrate, the alliances look inward. How can we be more cohesive? How can we cooperate more? How can we, synchronize our higher education systems at the same heartbeat? We're talking about the aims of Bologna.
At the same time, there's a few alliances that have, for example, their identity and what they feel brings them together is looking outwards at the EU. For example, there's an alliance called CIVIS, which is mostly focused on building links with institutions throughout Africa. And each of the institutions in the EU had a privileged partner in different African countries, and they consider that that's their main identity. So there's a few alliances who are also projected outwards despite this integration.
And also the alliances, one of the goals is that the alliance is supposed to make higher education, European higher education sector more attractive. So the alliances should bring talent, that is both students and researchers from all over the world to counter the brain drains to the US and now to China with a lot of leading scholars and also students right from different countries going in different directions. This is Europe's answer to attract the students and academics to contribute to the future competitiveness of Europe.
And it gives them the possibility to be on a level playing field to cooperate with much larger institutions that don't exist in the EU. Like, for example, the University of Buenos Aires, like absolutely massive. There's no institution in the EU like this. An alliance could have the possibility to develop a partnership with such a university and be actually on a level playing field for like, at least some coordinators that I could give that much of this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Miguel Lim, the University of Manchester, but in relation to the EU, so I was working with the EU support for higher education in the ASEAN region called EU Share, which is now the last funding budget is now called EU Scope, 7-year project. And I think great work that's, I think, being looked upon in regions outside of Europe as well to see what's going on in Europe. And sometimes, since it's very new, I'm sure it will trickle down to other regions, including Southeast Asia in the future. So just from the Southeast Asian country, my impression going around stakeholders in Southeast Asia is that they'd like to implement kind of these policy innovations in higher education in Europe, but at low cost, So last year they had this declaration of the common space in higher education in Southeast Asia. Big thing, that kind of mirrors the language of the European higher education here, but that's costless. It doesn't cost them anything to make this declaration. So they're trying to do similar to Erasmus Mundus to improve intra-regional mobility, but at no cost as well. So I guess my first question is about sustainability and finances. So how much of this would happen without the financial incentives, or how much of it will continue without the financial incentives, or for regions like Southeast Asia, is this possible in a good, lower cost way, the kind of innovation, the EUI innovation that you're talking about? And second is, are there other industrial, is this a case sui generis, or are there other sectors within Europe, like finance, aviation, where some of those models about integration or alliances are being applied, or the kind of legislative or policy thinking is being applied, or is this the first of its kind to try and reorganize the sector?
Thanks so much. Very interesting question, definitely food for thought. I think we have seen also with the Bologna process that this also trickled down to other regions over time, and the different areas were emerging. In terms of sustainability and finance of the initiative, I think we have seen from our research that there's not much money going into the initiative when you see how it is spread out. So basically, each of them gets like an Erasmus budget kind of for an Erasmus project. So they're doing quite a lot with quite little. However, we see that they are reluctant many times to, the objectives of the initiative are across the missions, so education, research, and engagement with society, but the Erasmus only funds education cooperation. And we have seen a reluctance to, put institutional funding behind these other missions for alliances, because institutions think, oh, I can do it on my own, I have my other partners, why should I invest in this? I don't know where it is going, so this uncertainty in the policy making. So I think even if it's little money, it does help to secure interest in developing those areas. And for many institutions, it's not much money. So it's 0.0001% of their budget, while for other institutions in Eastern Europe, it's an important contribution to internationalization, and it's also very prestigious to be part of this. So it puts them on the map and on a more level playing field with partners they would have liked to cooperate with maybe, but didn't get the chance. Cooperation that has happened before, I think it's not the first time that it is happening. We have seen an institutionalization of cooperation, especially like the European Institute for Innovation and Technology makes these knowledge innovation communities that bring together partnerships from across Europe on particular issues. So there is some experience there, and also this mapping study from before the alliance showed that many institutions were already cooperating before and were already doing many of this kind of stuff. But I guess, having like a stamp and an umbrella under which to do it that is so prominent also for national members now helps. So I think this excellence, this selling it as an excellence thing helped people to actually put their own resources behind it and make it cheaper for the commission and for others. So I guess that would be the advice for South Asia.
On whether how much of it would continue. It wouldn't be to the same scale, probably, from alliances that I've spoken to. Most in the alliances and in the representatives of alliances I talk to, they do really intend, and they have to, when they apply, they have to develop long-term strategies beyond the project term funding. And a lot of them really intend to continue those. So very few, but some even intend to create a university. They're really working towards becoming, in 10, 15, 20 years, a one institution. The legal status, a lot of the alliances are developing, and there isn't currently kind of like the best. So they are trying different ones, the European Economic Interest Group, the ESL, the different models. But in there, they often, each member pays in their own money, and they fund activities. It's not the money that they get from the commission. They pay in their own money and then operate as entity from different activities beyond what's in the agreement. I agree, for a lot of institutions, it's not a lot of money. I work in Switzerland. The equivalent that the Swiss government gives, the equivalent, actually less, 60%, and Swiss universities have to contribute 40%. That funds one post of coordinator but it's one person cannot read this, so there are cool teams running this. So they are definitely not doing this for the money. There is really a view that this is important, that this collaboration in Europe is important, that we cannot have a competitive Europe without working together. So that a lot want in. There are 65 alliances, but there are in total 250 applications. So probably most, maybe not most, but very many more institutions want to be values despite the cost of getting together, starting some collaboration before you can even buy.
The alliances have this fun saying among each other that they were asked to promise the moon and they were given a bicycle to reach it. That's often what they consider. But joke aside, like the lack of funding does pose some real issues, particularly in regards to HR. You have people, so as Agata mentioned, it doesn't fund many posts. So you end up having people who work in international offices where you have full-time jobs on other projects. You know, the alliances is just a product amongst others, who have to work extra hours, not necessarily paid on the alliances. And some speak of burnouts and whatnot. So it actually has some direct issues. It's all great that they're not doing it for the money, but the lack of funding does pose some real issues. However, despite the fact that, for example, the Commission hasn't set forward a research call specifically geared towards the alliances have been starting to apply for existing Horizon calls as alliances. And they, from what we're starting to see, they're starting to be quite successful in actually obtaining that funding. So there will be probably some other avenues to get some funding, even if it's not a continuation or an increase of the Erasmus Plus funding for PhD. I still hear both.
That's what I wanted to say.
Sorry.
It's very impressive. I'm wondering if this is a model you would recommend to other regions such as Asia.
You repeat that, sorry, who would
Yeah,
recommend
this
it?
is a model you would recommend to other regions, Asia, Africa.
I would say that given the geopolitics we are seeing nowadays emerging, it would be great if the plan of higher education would be to continue cooperation rather than closing inwards. I think we also in many cases have seen science diplomacy lines closing down because of the conflicts happening. I think more cooperation is, the answer to the future of these problems we see with emerging nationalisms and this like multipolar fight that we are experiencing now, and these tariffs and this insanity that is filling our news feeds. Yeah, so I think I would recommend.
It's maybe not. It's not an easy thing to deliver, and so you bring together several institutions from different countries. They speak different languages, so different cultural backgrounds, and now they have to reach consensus on lots of different issues. There are issues of who is leading, is there power imbalances within the institutions. It's not an easy thing to do, and maybe arguably some parts of Europe have the shared language. I mean that we do all study English since kindergartens. So especially the international staff, at least some people can work together. In other regions, it might be maybe more difficult in where just the cultural and the language issues might be more difficult to overcome.
And I don't think there's a world region that necessarily has an executive branch like the European Commission that is there to also push these ideas. And we saw, like this tug of war. You do have the Commission like pushing member states and tailing member states to go in certain directions. So it would require imagining other world regions that have maybe a structure like this, which to my knowledge is sort of the case.
Can I just add on like with any policy transfer, I mean, it can be hugely problematic if you take something out of context and put it in another context. So that in mind, I think with what we presented today and with the research that is out there are some tenets of this initiative, of this policy development that are more general, that are transferable, like the way the ownership of the sector was sought in a space where there's lack of competence, lack of an executive, where the ownership and the buy-in of the sector was sought after and invested in, and it took time. And I think that is an element that whatever that you kind of need to have in place if you're going to transfer this to somewhere else, and then adjust it to the context. These kind of alliances may not be in the exact form, but some parts of how this initiative came about are transferable, I think.
The University of Geneva, and I just wanted to kind of follow up on what was said just a few minutes ago on, in terms of impact, in your analysis, do you see, have these alliances really resulted in more collaborations, or have the existing collaborations been kind of eaten up into, you mentioned now the alliances applying to the existing Erasmus funding. Well, they existed before, everyone was already applying and getting those fundings. Now the alliances are, so has it just changed sort of the structure of the collaborations and existing collaborations? Have there really been new? I feel like a lot of the programs that are now being implemented within the alliances are not really new. They're kind of like the old ones, just with the new kind of, it's more like a hype to it. There's a branding, there's the logo, there's the name. Each alliance has its own branding. So there's a bit of a hype to it. A lot of universities join these alliances without having time to think. And you mentioned this yourself. It was like, oh my God, everyone's doing this, we have to do this. And now they're like, oh, okay, so this is what it meant. It was, and I feel like a lot of the collaborations are not necessarily new, revolutionary, or it's more like having changed it into sort of a new branding. But do you see this in your analysis, or?
I think this is what we meant also with this. Is this a new idea with old clothes, or an old idea with new clothes? Because there is this tension of like what is new about it. We jokingly also call the initiative Erasmus on steroids. Because it just kind of continues this cooperation approach that we have seen emerging over the years. What is different is that cooperation doesn't happen anymore like in Erasmus on individual academics making connections and applying for this cause, or departments working together, but it's a more whole institutional approach that is sought to cooperation. So universities actually cooperate with others, not departments and not academics. At the level to which this has already been achieved, it's not that advanced. So that's why it's a maturing kind of idea of collaboration rather than established new form of collaboration, I'd say.
It has some impact. So, for example, in Switzerland, which has been funding it on their own, even in Switzerland, the budgets stopped growing. They're not going to be slashed yet next year, but the funding has been moved. So part of the SEM, which is the Swiss answer to Erasmus, so Swiss money for the Erasmus exchanges, has been moved to fund the alliances participation. So it affected the non-participating institutions, which can be problematic. It's not anymore because majority of Swiss institutions, out of 21 universities, for next year 15 will be part. So maybe not that many issues anymore between participating and non-participating institutions. Maybe in wider Europe, that's not necessarily a similar issue.
And just also, you were mentioning that like the alliances, like they had very little time, so the institutions had very little time to join alliances and to decide to join alliances. That was true in 2019 and 2020, were the initial calls. But then there was top-up funding, and that was already after 3 years of existence. If it really didn't make sense, or if it really was something that the institution didn't feel that they wanted to be, they could have left the alliances, which some left alliances, but to go to another alliance. So they still considered that it was an initiative that they wanted to still be part of, and nobody forced the alliances to continue asking for funding, for example. And if the senior leadership of the institutions considered it wasn't worthwhile, they wouldn't have come forward with it. And now we're 6 years later. The last call was last year, and you still have 60 initial new alliances that has to be formed. And you're right, there is a hype and everything. However, there's also the possibility now to take a little step back to see if it's an initiative that institutions want to participate in a little bit. And in regards to the success, yeah, it's cooperation that existed before, but it has been successful in a few things, not least of which the geographical balance in regards to cooperation. I think this heavy push on North, South, East, West collaboration was something that was lacking in the EU, and which has been achieved, like out to a wider degree, making it such a small condition for the funding. So that's one of the examples, I think, which is something the
And I think with this, we should stop so that we don't. But if you want to talk to us, you're more than welcome. Enjoy the lunch.